It just keeps happening, the country dipping in and out of a near constant state of emergency.
She's right. In 2002, there were 4 declared days of local states of emergency. This year alone, more than 70. And it's not a one-off. We've seen the numbers build up this century, and it's dramatic. So what does that tell us about what's going on? I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly.
And I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, states of emergency.
Met Service warning about the possible threat to life from significant flooding and slips, issuing a red heavy rain alert, its highest level.
3 states of emergency have also been declared. They're in Otorohanga and Waipa districts, which have been hammered, and Tararua set for heavy rain tonight.
The heavy rain has led to states of emergency now being declared in Whangarei, Coromandel, Hauraki, Bay of Plenty and Gisborne districts.
In developing news, New Zealand has declared a state of emergency.
A state of emergency has now been declared.
Remain under states of emergency.
So why are we declaring so many? What constitutes one? Who has the power? And do we risk emergency fatigue? Today we're talking to 2 experts, 2 different Johns, Sharon, about what really goes on behind the scenes.
Yes, I'm talking to John Law. He's the voice of weather at Met Service. And what I can tell you is the forecasters can see the bad weather coming days, even weeks before the rest of us. And that's thanks to some of the world's most powerful computers. But there's still a lot of uncertainty until really just before it hits.
And I chat, Sharon, to John Mitchell. Now, he works at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University. He's a councillor on the Lakes District Council with emergency management responsibility, and he's actually been involved with emergency management both here and overseas for 30 years. Now, Sharon, he puts the spike in states of emergency down in part to climate change, so of course the weather is getting worse, but also says weather services are getting better at forecasting, and there's been a culture change which has actually encouraged authorities to declare early.
If you wait until the events occurred, you lose much of the benefit of being able to declare a state of emergency. So things are happening more often and we're more likely to make a declaration. What a declaration means when it is made, at the local level, it automatically has a 7-day period that it's made for. That can be extended, and we've seen that happening with major events recently. But it does several things. It enables those appointed as regional or group controllers in particular, but also local controllers where they are appointed, to have special powers to intervene in the emergency. It also enables police officers to have those powers too, where there's any need to act even faster perhaps, and particularly if there isn't communication and there may only be police with a degree of authority on the ground. So that's the ability to require people to evacuate, to enter buildings, to remove vehicles that might be damaged, blocking streets, to clear roads, to close roads, to acquire resources through requisition, a whole range of things. But it also provides protection too for those involved in the response. So anyone who takes action during a declared state of emergency, as long as it's a reasonable action, and they are authorised as part of the response to do so, they're protection from liability if there's any damage. So, the term I like to use in that context is that sometimes to manage risks, you have to be prepared to take risks. So it enables people to have more confidence who are responding to do things they might need to do that they normally wouldn't be able to do outside of an emergency situation.
So it sort of genuinely speeds up response and ultimately saves lives. I want to know, though, from you, John, what legally sort of constitutes a state of emergency? How high is that threshold before authorities can, I guess, pull the trigger?
Yeah, well, legally the bar is quite low in that any incident that has occurred or may occur that threatens the safety of individuals or property. And there is a list in the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act of a whole range of potential hazards, and it covers everything, including, as we saw in 2020, human disease pandemic.
Yes.
The other condition is that it requires a significant coordinated response. There's some suggestion that it has to be a situation in which the emergency services and other organisations couldn't reasonably manage the response, without the powers of a declaration. So they're the sort of questions that are asked. Do we need the powers to enable this situation to be less bad than it would be otherwise? But the bottom line really these days is, does it need a significant coordinated response? What a declared state of emergency does, it requires the agencies and other organisations who have been involved to work together in a coordinated way. It also gives a signal to the community that a coordinated response is occurring and that there is a focus on the needs of communities that will be arising from the potential or actual emergency. There are questions sometimes asked about, are we declaring too often?
Yeah, that is definitely one of my questions.
We haven't, I think, reached anything like that threshold in Aotearoa, New Zealand at this stage. The reality is that we're having a significant number of emergencies. The situations where a coordinated response is necessary and that we need to communicate to communities that it's being taken seriously. But what we can't do is hesitate and hope that things are going to get better, or just hope that the communities and the response organisations will work together effectively. We have powers there with the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act that require that coordination to occur. So it's certainly not a decision taken lightly by the politicians, and it's always politicians, elected officials, who make the decision, but on the advice of the senior officials of the organisations involved.
Very quickly, how does that work though? So say, does the Mayor then contact the Minister or NEMA? How is it that they can actually get the right to say, I want our city, our town, our region, whatever, in a state of emergency?
Yeah, good question. So there is no need for a mayor or any other local official. It could be a councillor, or it could be, in some cases, it could be a community board chair, whoever's designated at that level. They don't need to refer to the minister to make a declaration of a state of emergency. They have the power to do so as of right. They are required to consult with the senior officials involved. In almost every instance, they will be in communication with National Emergency Management Agency staff, who will then be communicating directly with the National Emergency Management Office in Wellington.
Do you worry, John, about emergency fatigue? Because, we have got so many in place at the moment that they start to sort of lose maybe their urgency, the impact, or perhaps even people complying with them because they go, it's not a big deal, everyone's in one all the time.
There's been quite a bit of research into that, and the impact of not declaring and leaving communities entirely to their own devices, really, or organisations to not act together in a coordinated way, communities tire of that much more quickly than they do of having an organised response supporting them.
Interesting, yes.
Yeah. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, the fatigue in other ways is real. We have, particularly the response organisations, the same people, whether they're volunteers or professionals, same people responding again and again, and for some communities, particularly Gisborne, Tairāwhiti, who are themselves responding again and again. If they didn't have a state of emergency to enable them to do some of the things that they did, and that resources would be brought in from elsewhere in the region, in that case Unitary Authority, neighbouring regions and nationally to support them, they would certainly be more physically and psychologically fatigued than they would at all from knowing that a declaration of a state of emergency has been made. So, yes, we need to be careful about not doing it at the drop of a hat for any minor event. If you look at the emergencies within which declarations have been made in the last 10 years, there isn't one where, in hindsight, it would have been better to have not declared. The opposite is true. When we have particularly the Auckland anniversary weekend storm and then immediately subsequent to that cyclone Gabriel, where declarations of state of emergency were not made in Auckland soon enough and in Hawke's Bay as early as they could have been. That contributed to communities not taking the situation as seriously as they might, and in fact contributed to some of the response organisations not being as proactive as they might. And people died in those contexts.
And do you think that did contribute to the deaths, as heartbreaking as that is? Would that be fair?
We can't say conclusively at all, but it was certainly part of the context where there would have been more focus if declarations had been made in some of those contexts. And we're seeing that through the reviews that have been done. It is better to do so than make sure that a response is stood up. If the event isn't as bad as it was predicted to have been, particularly with severe weather, then there's nothing lost. We do have to be careful that you're right, that over time that fatigue could enter. People might think that you're crying wolf, but it's better to act with the powers that we have to help protect communities in a measured way so that communities are protected as well as they can be and are enabled and encouraged to do the right thing themselves.
And that was John Mitchell, who has a wealth of experience when it comes to emergency situations. Basically, he says, act and act early.
What I found interesting from that, Amanda, is that John talks about emergency fatigue, and that's something that John Law also covers. The worry about overdoing it with the warnings. He was actually in the thick of it at Met Services National Forecast Centre in Wellington at the weekend as all these warnings and emergency calls rolled out.
Here we find teams of forecasters sitting around their desks, each of them looking after different parts of the forecast. So one team will look after the aviation forecast, for example. One team will look after the forecast we find on the website and that go out to the TV companies and the radio. And one will look after the marine desk. Overseeing this are our lead and our expert forecasters, like the conductors of an orchestra, tying it all together. So we've got computers, monitors everywhere with maps, webcam views of various bits and bobs around the country, and these giant screens, which are our situational awareness screens with the latest radar, the latest satellite images, and some of the observations as well. So trying to keep us up to date with what's happening now so we get a nice firm idea of what's going to happen in the future.
Just wondering what the atmosphere is like.
I think generally as we head through into severe weather, the situation tends to be very quiet and very hard work in the office, as everyone seems to be focusing on the forecast when there's lots of intricacies coming through. But every day we have these what's called nod-in. Now, this dates back to when the chief forecaster used to stand up and tell everyone what the forecast was going to be, and the rest of the forecasters, the rest of the meteorologists would sit around and nod in agreement. Nowadays, it's a bit more of a collaborative affair. We still have these meetings. We still call them the nod-ins, but the lead forecaster will talk about what the forecast, what the situation is. They'll bring in the expert forecasters. These are the guys people who write the forecast and the severe weather forecast and those watches and warnings, and they'll give us a briefing on how they're thinking. And then we'll get input from the rest of the meteorologists. So the marine forecaster might have been looking really closely at some of the stronger winds through Cook Strait, for example. We'll bring it together and make our general overview, and then we can make sure that the forecast for Wellington that goes on the website is the same as the one that goes through to our marine forecast, which is the same that we send through to the pilots landing.
So over the weekend, you've got this chaos going on outside. What's it been like in there? Because your updates are so frequent, aren't they?
We've got a network at Met Service of around about 200 weather stations, which stretch everywhere from Cape Reinga down towards Bluff and even down towards the sub-Antarctic islands. Now, they'll send through data, some of them every minute. So you're always getting this information. And in some situations, that minute-by-minute data is incredibly useful, giving you latest amounts of rainfall and those kind of things, or the strongest gusts. But we'll also get observations from radar. Every 7.5 minute, a new radar image will come through. There's 10 of those across the country. And there's also satellites sending back observations every 15 minutes or so. Add into that new runs of the computer model every 6 hours. There's this constant flow of information coming in. And we've got deadlines for our forecasts, making sure we keep them updated through the website, through information that go out to TV companies, to radio stations, and also out to the members of the public through the app as well. So we want to make sure we keep all that information running through. And you can imagine that as soon as there's active weather, particularly weather that impacts a lot of places, it starts to become busier on things like the phones. We have a lot of questions from journalists, from media, but also from some of our other customers, like the aviation industry want to know, are the airport's going to get closed? From the mariners heading out across the waters want to know the swell through Cook Strait. All of these people are very keen on the weather. So you're trying to tie together all the latest observations, all that information, and to tie it into a coherent story which we can then share with as many people as possible.
So what happened at the weekend? Because there were several state of emergencies called in local areas. Does that first warning come from you?
So we normally start our warnings several days in advance. We have a severe weather outlook. It's about 6 days out, and we'll flag up in that when areas are looking like they could potentially bring some severe weather. So strong winds like gales around their area, or heavy rain, or even, thankfully not in the summer, but large amounts of snow. So these are the things that we look for in that broad scale. And we tend to then work closely with the regional authorities. If we issue any watches or warnings, normally around about 2 or 3 days out, we might issue the first of those watches. We'll get in touch with those regional authorities. We'll give them a call. We'll talk to their hydrologists, who are the people who look after the rivers and understand how those systems flow in their different areas, and talk about the expected rain we've got coming through. And we'll also chat to the teams there who look after their civil defence and bring in that multi-agency briefings as well, particularly as we have situations where we have lots of areas being impacted. We might try and talk to more than one set at a time. Once the warnings come through, we work really closely with the regional authorities to decide if we're going to go red. Now, that's the real key here. Those red warnings are really reserved for the most extreme weather. And we work really closely with the teams on the ground to understand the situation, to find out how concerned are they. Do they think their river systems and flooding can cope with this? Because there's lots of things that go into once those impacts happen. For example, has it been incredibly wet? Is the ground already really saturated? Are they concerned the rivers are already high? Do you need any more rainfall to kind of cause those issues?
How far out can you see that bad weather coming?
So we'll look out as much as, I would say, 10 days will give you a good idea. However, it doesn't take much for that weather to be drastically different. If the system just shifts a little bit further towards the east or the west, it can have big impacts on where the heaviest rainfall comes from or where the strongest winds are. We'll often look a little bit further away, particularly up in towards the tropics, just to see how things are developing through there. And what we're really looking at once we start to get beyond about a week or two is really the trend. Does it look to be more unsettled than normal? Does it look to be warmer or colder? As we get closer, we can start to see which of those systems are likely to build and run through and where they're likely to track. But really, it's a case of the further away you are, the more uncertainty. And as we get closer and closer, we start to be able to get those subtleties and nuances of the forecast into place.
You can see this bad weather coming through what? Because you're looking at satellite imagery, you're looking at lots of data.
That's exactly it. So one of the things we look at really closely are computer models. Now, these are complex mathematical programs that try and model the atmosphere as a series of equations. Some of these computer models are substantially some of the most powerful computers we have on the planet. These are huge, powerful beasts, and we tend to look at 3 of these big global models that come through. Now, the hard thing is, as soon as you start looking at more than one of anything, you end up with several different answers. And especially as we look further into the future, you can have a real spread of what the potential for these weather systems can be. And that's often one of the biggest challenges is when we look at the forecast, particularly for, 3, 4, 5, 6 a week away, is there can be a lot of uncertainty. And as we've seen with just this big system of low pressure, where that exact path goes can have a real big impact on which areas see the most rainfall or which areas see the strongest winds. And we try to marry up the uncertainty with not producing too many watches or warnings. We want to make sure that when we issue any severe weather warnings or alerts, they are ones that we think that we've got high certainty that they're going to run through. We want to make sure we're not crying wolf, as it were. But we still flag up those potential situations with the teams on the ground, and we give them try and express our uncertainties on those as well.
Now, Amanda, there's a lot of comparisons with the devastation that we're seeing at the moment and what happened with Tropical Cyclone Gabrielle, which, by the way, I calculated, triggered more than 40 states of emergency. And John Law says these 2 storms were very different.
So Cyclone Gabrielle was this big beast of a system that came in from the north, this tropical cyclone. We had a really good lead time, and it was actually very well modelled. There was a lot of agreement in the models as it came through. It moved through, it brought those horrendously strong winds, those devastating impacts, and huge amounts of rainfall, but it moved off very quickly. This system we have formed to the north of us again, brought all that moisture. You remember last week we had all that high humidity air over us as well. It was really muggy, all down to that same system. But to the east of us, we've got a big blocking area of high pressure. Like you say, lots of areas impacted, a slow-moving system that's just taking its time to clear away. But thankfully, we're starting to see the edge of that now.
But, I mean, have you experienced anything like this before?
It's always a tricky one to compare weather systems as we go through. I think for me, Cyclone Gabrielle will always stand out as being an incredibly devastating impact, just because of the sheer number of places that were impacted and, building on top of that incredibly wet system.
That must make your job so much more stressful these days, does it?
I think for me, it's not so much stressful, but it's definitely, you feel valued, which is very nice. And I think people in New Zealand are so keen to talk about the weather, and it has such a huge impact on everything from day-to-day life right the way through to, those big decisions people are making.
What happens if you get it wrong?
That's a great question. It is a weather forecast. The future is not written in stone. We can give our best forecast. We can give our best estimation on the information we have at the time. And it's really hard as a forecaster because, a lot of us are scientists and mathematicians. We don't like to be wrong. But at some point, you have to accept that the forecast isn't going to be 100% right. There are going to be situations where things don't quite work out as well as you could, or there's going to be differences and changes to how things play out. And I think if the forecast doesn't go to plan, there's always going to be changes that we can make, and always look back and to learn and to see how we can change. And is it something small we can do? Is it something big we can do? But it's that learning curve. And I think that's the thing that we all have to kind of appreciate, that the forecast won't be 100% right, but it'll be the best we can at the time.
That was John Law, and we thank him for his insight.
And that's actually it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Mark Chesterman. I'm Amanda Gillies.
And I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. And thanks also to John Mitchell, who gets the last word today. And it's a really important message. Kiwis need to be prepared for an emergency.
If we're waiting until the declaration's made to be prepared, in most cases, it's probably too late. So have a plan, at least collectively in your heads, on what you're going to do. And that's to move somewhere safe or help others to move somewhere safe. And it is always best to do so as early as you can. So being prepared, if you like, in a psychological sense is critical. Also, though, having some resources available. Ideally, if you know that you live in a low-lying area, and this is what some of the schools are doing on Gisborne Tairāwhiti, they have preparedness equipment in safe places on higher ground that are easy to get to. So rather than having to go and find their bag of equipment, which might be change of clothes, a small amount of food, maybe a torch, a radio so they can listen to warnings that are coming from Radio New Zealand and others, potentially some two-way communication, rather than having to get that together. In those cases, they've already got it somewhere safe, so the kids, along with the teachers, they can get them. They don't need to waste time. In most preparedness situations, we'll be having a go bag for each individual and perhaps collectively. But being ready to move is essential, and having a plan about where you're going to go is critical too.